Imagine you are sitting in a theater, right? You're watching this massive, elaborate stage production.
Yeah, like a really high-end Broadway show.
Right. You see the actors delivering their lines, the dramatic lighting is shifting across the stage, and the sudden fall of the curtain.
Hmm.
To your eyes, the reality of the play is entirely contained in what is visible on the stage. But behind the curtain, there's an entire invisible world operating in the dark.
Oh, for sure. The stagehands, the riggers.
Yeah, there are stagehands pulling massive ropes, directors whispering frantic cues into headsets, counterweights silently dropping to raise scenery.
All the stuff you never see.
Right. The visible drama is completely dependent on an invisible reality that you cannot perceive from your seat.
And, well, we tend to view our lives and human history with that same limited vision.
We really do. We just look at what is right in front of us.
We look at the visible actors, our circumstances, political movements, the physical tragedies of our day, and we just assume we're seeing the whole picture.
But we aren't. Not even close. No, we aren't. So what if the true reality of the universe is happening backstage, entirely out of sight? Welcome to Reformed Thinking.
Glad to be here.
You are stepping into a diagnostic landscape today that requires us to look past the physical world. We have to examine the unseen forces acting on our souls.
And we have some incredible source material to help us do that.
We really do. We are looking at a text that strips away the visible illusion. For this deep dive, we have gathered St. Augustine's Expositions on the Book of Psalms.
Specifically, his intense, sweeping analysis of Psalm 9.
Yeah, Psalm 9. Our mission today is to unpack his perspective on what he calls the hidden things of the Son.
It is such a heavy phrase, the hidden things.
It is. We are going to examine the nature of divine providence, how God governs the world behind the scenes, and we will walk through Augustine's concept of the internal psychological cities constructed inside the human mind.
Augustine looks at the text of this single psalm and extracts a staggering architectural schematic of how God interacts with humanity.
Yeah, he really pulls back the curtain.
He does not isolate his analysis to grand historical events either. He forces the reader to look at the minute, invisible affections of the individual human heart.
He makes it so personal.
Very personal. He establishes a severe contrast between what we perceive with our physical senses and the spiritual reality unfolding underneath.
Okay, so the deep dive starts right at the inscription of the psalm. The text reads, "To the end for the hidden things of the Son, a psalm of David himself."
That inscription sets the tone for the whole thing.
It really does. Augustine fixes his attention on that phrase immediately. He argues this refers specifically to the only-begotten Son of God.
Which makes sense.
But I want to point out the grammatical anomaly he highlights. The text does not specify whose son.
Right, it just says the Son.
Yeah, it leaves out the possessive pronoun entirely.
That omission is highly intentional. Augustine notes that elsewhere in Scripture, when a son is mentioned, the father is explicitly named to avoid any ambiguity.
Like with David and Absalom?
Spot on. When David is fleeing, the text is careful to say he fled from the face of Absalom, his son. The writer provides the possessive marker so the reader understands the precise relationship.
But here, the text leaves the space blank.
It simply says the hidden things of the Son and assumes the reader's mind will immediately supply the correct subject.
I think about how that works in our normal communication. If a sovereign king issues an edict, the herald does not need to read the king's entire genealogy.
No, they would just say, the king commands it.
Exactly. The eminence of the subject demands no qualification. Or, to use Augustine's own illustration, it is like saying it is raining.
That is a great analogy.
You do not need to clarify who is doing the raining or what the sky is doing. The actor is universal understood without needing a name.
The excellency of the doer spontaneously presents itself to the mind.
But, why does Augustine focus so heavily on the hidden nature of Christ's first advent? If this is the supreme king, why does he arrive in secret?
Well, Augustine builds a framework of history divided by the two advents, or the two arrivals, of Christ.
Okay, the first and second coming.
Yes. The past advent was hidden. The future advent will be manifest.
Meaning obvious to everyone.
Right. In the first advent, Christ arrives in a way that actively contradicted human expectation. He did not arrive with a visible army. He did not conquer Rome.
Which is what everyone was waiting for.
Everyone. Because of this deliberate hiddenness, the Jewish people at the time largely misunderstood him. They were looking for a visible political monarch who would rearrange the earthly physical order.
They wanted the stage production to change.
That is a brilliant way to put it, but Augustine points out that this very failure to recognize the Son was actually profitable for the Gentiles.
Wait, how so?
The rejection caused by the hiddenness became the mechanism for the gospel to spread outward to the rest of the world.
Oh, right. He writes that blindness in part is happened to Israel, that the fullness of the Gentiles might come in.
Yes, so the hiddenness is a feature of how God is operating.
It is a deliberate sovereign tactic.
That is correct. This hiddenness reflects God's broader sovereign workings in the world. God operates continuously in ways that are imperceptible to human calculation.
Behind the scenes.
Always. The future advent will be undeniable. Every eye will see it, and the visible reality will finally match the spiritual reality.
But right now, we are living in the era of the hidden things.
We are. To perceive what God is doing requires a completely different set of senses.
This concept of a hidden advent naturally provokes a question about the present moment, doesn't it?
It definitely does.
If Christ's first coming was hidden, then it is entirely logical that his ongoing present-day interactions with the world might also be hidden.
Which brings us to a massive theological concept.
Yeah, this introduces Augustine's theory of the two judgments.
Augustine observes that most individuals isolate the concept of divine judgment to a singular future event at the end of time.
Like the final courtroom scene.
Right. But he identifies two distinct judgments in Scripture. There is the manifest judgment, which will happen at the end of history, but there is also a hidden judgment occurring right now.
Right.
Every single day. Behind the curtain of mundane reality, God is executing a secret judgment upon the earth.
I want to illustrate this hidden judgment with the analogy of a blacksmith's forge.
I love this analogy.
Imagine a massive blazing furnace. You take a piece of raw material and thrust it into the intense heat. The fire itself is a neutral force, right?
Yeah, it's just heat.
But it causes drastically different reactions depending entirely on the nature of the material it touches.
It exposes what the material actually is.
Exactly. If you put gold covered in impurities into the fire, the heat purges the dross, leaving the metal stronger and more refined.
But if you put dry stubble or pure slag into that exact same fire, the material is completely consumed.
It just burns up. The heat of the forge represents the daily afflictions, tragedies, and trials of human life.
The things we all go through.
With that mechanism in mind, how does Augustine say we're supposed to process everyday suffering?
Augustine details three distinct purposes for this current hidden judgment. When the fire of affliction enters a person's life, it accomplishes one of three specific sovereign ends.
Okay, what is the first one?
First, it purifies those who are being exercised by it. This is the gold being refined. The suffering actively burns away their reliance on worldly comforts and strengthens their faith.
It hurts, but it makes them better.
Right. Second, it warns individuals toward conversion. The sudden heat of the fire disrupts their earthly security, wakes them up to their frail mortality, and drives them to seek God.
It's like a wake-up call.
A very severe wake-up call. But the third purpose is incredibly sobering.
Yeah, the third purpose is blinding. Augustine states that if a person aggressively despises the calling and discipline of God, this hidden judgment actually blinds them unto damnation.
The same heat that melts wax will harden clay.
That is a terrifying thought. The suffering hardens them in their rebellion.
It really does. If a person resists the correction of the forge, the hidden judgment is actively preparing them for the manifest judgment.
The final one.
Yes. Augustine clarifies that passing from death to life via affliction is the very essence of the hidden judgment. When you suffer, and that suffering strips away your pride and drives you to God, you have already been judged, and you have passed into life.
You survive the forge.
But those who endure the fire and are not corrected by it are storing up wrath. They will face the manifest judgment at the end of time, where everyone will be forced to confess that Christ is Lord.
But at that future point, the confession will not bring salvation.
No, it will only secure their damnation.
Acknowledging that current suffering is an active, divine, hidden judgment forces a radical shift in human perspective.
It changes everything about how you view your life.
It means you cannot look at a tragedy, a financial collapse, or a medical diagnosis and write it off as bad luck or random chance.
No, there is no such thing as random chance here.
You are forced to look at it as a deliberate strike of the blacksmith's hammer. And that brings an immense weight to what Augustine calls full-hearted confession.
Augustine states that confessing with a whole heart means refusing to doubt God's providence in any particular aspect of life.
You have to accept the whole package.
You cannot compartmentalize your theology. You cannot say, God is sovereign over my eternal salvation, but this sudden illness was just a biological accident.
He is unsparing about this.
Hmm.
He writes that fools believe things happen by random chance, as if the universe is governed by a roll of the dice.
Which is how a lot of people think, honestly.
But the wise refer all afflictions to divine governance. Now, I want to challenge this for a second because he pushes this to an extreme that feels entirely counterintuitive to human nature.
Oh, he absolutely does.
He talks about rejoicing in tribulation. He says a person with a whole heart sees the hidden things of the wisdom of God and therefore rejoices when things go wrong physically.
It contradicts every biological instinct we possess.
Completely.
The human animal is wired to avoid pain and seek comfort at all costs. But Augustine reasons that if you truly believe the forge is purifying your eternal soul, then the destruction of your temporary comfort is a legitimate reason for joy.
Because you are watching the dross burn away.
Yes, you are experiencing the hidden judgment that leads to life.
To illustrate the superiority of the invisible over the visible, Augustine makes a staggering claim about miracles.
This is one of my favorite parts of his argument.
He compares the invisible miracle of the Apostle Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus to the highly visible miracle of Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead.
Two very famous biblical events.
And Augustine argues that Paul's conversion is actually the superior miracle. I read that and had to pause.
It catches you off guard.
It really does. Lazarus was dead in a rock tomb for 4 days. He was wrapped in grave clothes, his body was undergoing decay, and he walked out breathing.
A literal zombie scenario, reversed.
Right. To the human mind, reanimating a decaying corpse is the absolute pinnacle of miraculous activity.
From a carnal perspective, led wholly by the eye, Lazarus is the greater spectacle. Humans are captivated by the physical reversal of death.
Because we can see it.
But Augustine unpacks a hierarchy of miracles here. He points out that visible miracles merely call the soul to the light. They act as an alarm bell.
They just get your attention.
Exactly. They get the attention of a lethargic mind. But invisible miracles actually enlighten the soul that responds.
Okay, break that down for us.
When Paul, who was breathing murderous threats against the early church, suddenly has his entire internal architecture rewritten so that he becomes the greatest evangelist for the very people he was hunting, that is a resurrection of the human will.
Lazarus rose from the dead physically, but he eventually died again. His physical body still had a biological expiration date.
That is a crucial point.
But Paul's soul, rising from spiritual death, is an eternal resurrection. It cannot be reversed.
This analysis forces us to evaluate the nature of faith itself. True faith, according to Augustine, requires moving past a desire for visible physical interventions.
We have to stop looking for the stage tricks.
Spot on. If your belief in God is contingent upon Him fixing your physical ailments or optimizing your earthly circumstances, your faith is anchored entirely to a temporary world.
To confess with a whole heart, you must perceive and value the invisible, sovereign workings of God in the soul.
The internal regeneration of a hostile will is far weightier than the external healing of a temporary body.
This internal, invisible focus changes what a person actually loves and enjoys.
It shifts your entire value system.
If the visible world is just a temporary training ground, seeking your ultimate joy in it becomes a logical absurdity. It forces a complete rejection of worldly pleasures.
Augustine notes that true exaltation is not found in earthly pleasures. It is not found in the consumption of rich food. It is not in the sweetness of perfumes. It is not in the accumulation of wealth.
It is not even in wedlock or perishable offspring.
Right. All of those things are passing shadows. True joy is found exclusively in the hidden things of the sun.
But the moment you transfer your joy from the visible to the invisible, you initiate an active war with the devil.
You paint a target on your back.
He says something brilliant about the mechanics of this war. He says the enemy is turned behind. He references Christ's temptation in the wilderness, where Jesus tells Satan, "Get thee behind me."
A very famous command.
Let's look at the psychology of this. If the devil is positioned behind us, acting as a persecutor, chasing us with malice, why does Augustine view this as a strategic advantage compared to the devil acting as a leader in front of us?
It is a brilliant psychological insight. When the enemy is positioned in front of you as a leader, he exerts dominion over earthly men through the mechanism of deception.
He plays the guide.
He holds out a counterfeit reward: wealth, fame, bodily indulgence. and humans willingly follow him.
They think he is leading them to the good stuff.
They assume they are walking toward autonomy and happiness, while he is quietly leading them toward a precipice. They love the things he offers, so they submit to his leadership without offering any resistance.
They walk into the slaughterhouse willingly because they are captivated by the music playing in the lobby.
Precisely. But when the enemy is defeated in his deceptions, when a believer sees through the illusion of worldly wealth and rejects the bait, the enemy loses his position in front.
He gets moved to the back.
He is turned behind. And from behind, his only remaining tactic is persecution. He acts with overt malice. He attempts to destroy the believer through external affliction.
But here is the severe irony of divine providence. His attacks actively drive the righteous to seek refuge in God.
The devil becomes like a violent sheepdog.
I was just thinking that he's barking and snapping at the heels of the flock, but the sheer terror of his attack drives the sheep straight into the shepherd's pen.
Fleeing persecution forces us into a posture of absolute reliance on the Creator, whereas following the enemy's deception leads to our quiet destruction.
This means God is sovereignly using the devil's own malice to accomplish the sanctification of his people.
God doesn't waste anything.
The devil intends to destroy the Christian with trials, but those very trials are the forge fire that purifies the Christian's faith.
The enemy's dominion relies entirely on the temporal, passing nature of the earthly realm. He only has leverage over things that can rust, rot, or be stolen.
Which sets up the contrast with the eternal reality Augustine describes next. He talks about how God effaces the name of the ungodly for the world's world.
That phrasing in English is somewhat clunky, isn't it? The world's world.
It is. Augustine uses it to distinguish between the temporal world we currently inhabit and the immutable eternity it shadows.
Right.
He says this current world is marked by endless cycles: the waning of the moon, the returning of the sun, the shift from spring to winter. It is a perpetual loop of things forming and passing away.
The world's world, in contrast, is the eternal reality that sits above our shifting timeline. It is the permanent, undisturbed realm of God's unchanging wisdom and governance.
This specific analogy Augustine uses here is masterful. He describes a verse in the mind and a verse in the voice.
Let's unpack that.
Think about a master composer writing a symphony. The sheet music residing in the composer's mind is permanent. It is conceptually perfect. It exists as a complete, unchangeable idea.
That represents the world's world.
Yes. But then the orchestra performs the music. The strings vibrate, the horns blow, and the physical sound waves hit your ears.
The actual performance.
Those sound waves are beautiful, but they instantly fade away into the air. They exist for a fraction of a second before they are gone forever. That represents our temporal world.
That analogy perfectly isolates the tragedy of the ungodly.
How so?
The ungodly are entirely invested in the fading sound waves. They build their entire identity, their wealth, and their concept of happiness on things that are actively vanishing into the atmosphere.
They're trying to hold on to the sound.
Because they lack eternal substance, because they have no anchor in the composer's permanent mind, their names are wiped out for eternity. God effaces their name.
The text says, "The ungodly will not be." You cannot construct a permanent identity out of fading echoes.
It is just mathematically impossible.
God's wisdom abides eternally, entirely undisturbed by the shifting temporal world. The earthly seasons change, massive political empires rise and fall, but the sheet music never alters.
Given that the eternal realm is totally secure and unshakable, we are forced to ask how the enemy manages to attack individuals right now in this temporal realm.
Right. If the sheet music is locked in, what is the devil doing?
If God's sheet music is permanently written, how does the devil execute so much destruction on earth? He achieves this through internal psychological warfare.
Augustine introduces the concept of the swords of the enemy. He says the devil uses swords to destroy souls, but these are not physical weapons manufactured from steel.
They are bad ideas.
They are erroneous opinions, false philosophies. And God responds by destroying the cities where the devil rules.
When a modern reader sees the word cities in the Psalms, they naturally assume a geographical location.
Right, we think of physical walls in Babylon, Jericho, or Rome.
But Augustine radically internalizes this concept. He defines a city as an entirely internal psychological structure erected within a single human being.
It operates like a hostile corporate takeover of the human mind.
That is a very accurate way to frame it.
He maps out the internal anatomy of sin using the structural hierarchy of a city government. First, you have the court, which he says consists of Crafty counsels.
The internal lawyers.
These are the deceitful rationalizations your brain generates to justify doing something wrong. It is the internal lawyer arguing why you deserve to harbor bitterness or indulge a craving.
Then you have the ministers or officers of this city. Those are your physical senses.
The eyes scanning for curiosity, the ears leaning in to listen to lasciviousness or malicious gossip, the hands reaching out for violence or theft.
The senses are not the originators of the sin. They are just the errand boys executing the orders drafted by the corrupt internal court.
And finally, you have the commonality, the riotous mob filling the city streets. Augustine says these are the soft affections and disturbing emotions of the mind.
Your daily anxieties, your sudden bursts of irrational anger, your intense cravings.
They are constantly stirring up daily seditions inside your own head.
It's chaotic.
So when you have a corrupt intellectual court, drafting rationalizations, physical senses acting as willing accomplices, and a mob of turbulent emotions rioting in the streets, you have literally built a thriving city for the devil to rule inside your own soul.
What is so piercing about this psychological analysis is that it traces the origin of all massive societal evil directly back to the individual human heart.
It scales up from the individual.
Bad physical cities, corrupt national governments, violent neighborhoods, oppressive systems, they only exist in the physical world because these internal psychological cities take root in individual men first.
You cannot generate a corrupt physical society without millions of corrupt internal courts operating independently in the minds of the citizens.
So if the enemy has established this internal infrastructure, how do you tear it down?
You cannot just arrest a thought. You cannot physically dismantle a crafty counsel.
Deliverance occurs when the word of truth wastes these internal kingdoms. The truth of God's word acts like a demolition crew against the crafty counsels.
It comes in with a wrecking ball.
It lays the evil thoughts to sleep. It pacifies the rioting affections. It takes the senses captive. So instead of your eyes looking for opportunities to sin, they are reading the scriptures.
Instead of your hands reaching for theft, they are extending outward in charity.
The entire infrastructure of the mind is conquered and transferred to the service of righteousness.
Escaping this internal city of sin requires abandoning all worldly attachments. The crafty counsels and the rioting emotions are always fighting over temporary worldly things.
They're fighting over money, social status, or physical pleasure.
Augustine uses this concept to construct his definition of true poverty.
When the Psalm says the Lord becomes a refuge for the poor, a modern reader naturally filters that through a socioeconomic lens.
We assume it means individuals with zero capital or assets.
But Augustine defines a poor man using an entirely different metric. He says a poor man is someone who loves nothing in this world that leaves him when he dies.
That is a staggering definition. By that standard, you could possess immense physical wealth. But if you hold that wealth with an open hand, recognizing it as a temporary tool rather than your ultimate source of love, you are spiritually poor.
Yes, and conversely, you could be living in absolute destitution. But if you are burning with constant envy and idolize the idea of wealth, you are spiritually rich in your affections.
And thereby excluded from this divine refuge.
The metric relies entirely on the affection of the heart. What is the object of your love?
Because every physical item in this world will either leave you while you live, or you will leave it when you die.
If your love is intrinsically tied to perishable items, your psychological state will be one of constant terror. You will be perpetually terrified of losing what you have acquired.
Augustine connects this specific kind of poverty to knowing God's name. I am that I am.
The name revealed to Moses.
If you look at the way temporal life operates, it is overwhelmingly stressful. The human condition is characterized by massive anxiety because we are constantly awaiting the future, worrying about what might happen tomorrow, next week, or next year.
Always looking ahead.
And simultaneously, we are in pain because we are losing the past, mourning the things that are slipping through our fingers and fading away.
Always looking behind.
Why is understanding God as pure, eternal, present existence the key to untethering ourselves from that worldly anxiety?
Because knowing God's name means knowing what the name signifies. Absolute eternity. In God's nature, nothing will be as if it has not happened yet and needs to be anxiously anticipated.
And nothing has been as if it is gone forever and needs to be mourned.
He's simply Ius. He is the eternal present. Time flows past the human observer like a rushing river, but God is the solid rock the river flows around.
We wait for a future event with eagerness, and it arrives, and in one fraction of a second it becomes the past, and we lose it with pain.
That is the agony of the human condition. If you anchor your hope in the rushing water of the river, you will be swept away in a constant, violent state of anxiety and grief.
But you cannot serve two masters.
No, you can't. If you apply your hope to the eternal existence of I am, you naturally cease placing your hope in transient, perishable wealth.
You realize that securing objects floating in the river is a fool's errand. You transfer your citizenship to the rock.
Those who fix their hope on that eternal name, who establish their footing on that rock, are gathered into a specific community.
Augustine identifies this community in the text as Zion.
The psalmist says, "Sing to the Lord who dwelleth in Zion." Augustine interprets the Hebrew word Sion to mean watching.
Watching, okay.
This represents the current church on earth. We are the watchers. We are standing on the wall looking for the dawn.
This is sharply contrasted with Jerusalem, which he translates as vision of peace. Jerusalem represents the future, eternal church in heaven.
Watching must precede vision. You have to stay awake in the dark before you get to see the sunrise.
And while the church is watching in the dark, she faces severe, crushing trials. The text mentions God remembering the blood of the martyrs. He hears the cry of the poor.
But we have to be careful with the language here.
I want to pause on the phrasing here because it raises a massive theological issue. The psalmist says, God hath remembered. If God is omniscient, does he actually suffer from forgetfulness?
It sounds like it, doesn't it?
Does the Creator set down a ledger and forget where he placed it? Augustine addresses this directly, doesn't he?
He does, and he is extremely careful to protect the theology of God's omniscience. God never forgets. He does not possess a faulty or lagging memory.
So why say he remembered?
The phrasing "he hath remembered" is an accommodation to human weakness. It is written in a linguistic style that a frail human mind can process and understand.
Because from a human perspective, when justice takes a long time, it feels like God has forgotten us entirely.
Exactly. God's judgment operates on such a massive, eternal timeline that humans who only live a few decades naturally assume he must have looked away.
We want justice by Friday afternoon.
Right. The wicked flourish, the righteous suffer terribly, and the human watcher cries out, "Did you forget?" So when the text says he remembers, it is assuring the watcher that the ledger is still perfectly balanced, even if the payout is severely deferred.
That brings a lot of comfort to the watchers.
Furthermore, Augustine clarifies that the cry of the poor is not just a chaotic multitude of individual human voices screaming for help.
What is it then?
It is actually Christ interceding for his members. The head of the church is actively crying out for the body, exalting them from what the text calls the gates of death.
To understand how God saves his people from those gates, we have to look at the contrast between the gates of death and the gates of Zion.
Augustine defines the gates of death as our depraved desires and our bodily senses.
Okay, break down the gate metaphor.
A gate is fundamentally an entrance. You walk through a gate to reach a specific destination. When you yield to a depraved desire, you are actively walking through a gate that leads directly to spiritual death.
In fact, Augustine argues that the very fulfillment of a wicked craving is actually death itself.
You think getting what you want will bring you life and satisfaction, but the fulfillment is the poison.
In contrast, the gates of Zion are high purposes, faith, and the sacraments. You walk through the gates of faith to eventually arrive at the vision of peace.
There is a striking metaphor from the text that perfectly illustrates how dangerous these gates of death are. Augustine says the foot of the soul is its love.
I thought that was so fascinating. Think about the mechanics of that. Your physical feet carry your physical body wherever you decide to go.
Yes.
The foot of your soul carries your spirit toward whatever object you love. If you love money, your soul relentlessly walks toward money. If you love God, your soul walks toward God.
Love is the gravitational pull of the inner man.
This is why sinners are caught in a snare. Their foot is tracked by the exact object they have chosen to love.
God's judgment on the wicked is terrifying in its passive nature. He does not always strike the wicked with a sudden lightning bolt from heaven.
Often, he executes judgment by simply handing them over to the works of their own hands.
He lets them have exactly what they want. It is the terrifying reality of Romans chapter 1. God gave them over.
When a person's love, their foot, is bound by deceitful delight, God abandons them to the lust of their own heart.
They step into the trap willingly because the bait looks delicious to their corrupted affections, but once the trap snaps shut, the very delight they sought becomes the chain that binds them.
And when they realize they are trapped, when the grim reality of their sin sets in, they try to pull away. But Augustine points out the agonizing psychology of repentance.
He does not sugarcoat it.
He says it hurts. It hurts like pulling a physical foot out of a rusty iron fetter, breaking a long-term addiction, walking away from a highly profitable but toxic relationship, giving up ill-gotten wealth. It causes immense psychological and emotional pain.
It is agonizing.
So giving way under the pressure of this pain, they refuse to withdraw. They choose to stay trapped in the snare because ripping their foot free is too agonizing to endure.
It is a dark psychological reality. They choose the familiarity of the trap over the pain of liberation.
This brings a severe internal division, which leads to the hidden joy of separation and the ultimate test of human history.
This is marked in the text by the sudden insertion of the word diapsalma.
A diapsalma is a musical term. It indicates an interlude, a pause in the singing of the psalm. But Augustine interprets it as representing the hidden joy of separation occurring right now in the human heart.
He likens it to the agricultural process of separating corn from chaff on the threshing floor.
The wheat and the weeds.
Right now, in the temporal world, the corn and the chaff are completely mixed together. The righteous and the wicked live in the same physical cities, they work at the same jobs, they suffer the same weather patterns.
The separation is not happening in physical space yet.
No, it is happening invisibly in the affections of the heart. The diapsalma is that secret, internal sorting process where God is marking his own.
The psalm concludes with a plea that honestly shocked me when I first read it. The psalmist prays to God to place a lawgiver over the nations.
It is a jarring request.
And Augustine identifies this lawgiver figure as the Antichrist. I read that and thought, why on earth would the psalmist actively pray for that? Why ask God to place the ultimate man of sin over the nations?
It sounds totally contradictory until you view it through the lens of God's absolute sovereign design.
God is still in control of the forge.
Permitting this figure to rise, allowing him to achieve a massive pitch of empty earthly glory and aggressively persecute the saints, is part of a deliberate theological purpose.
It is the ultimate operation of the blacksmith's forge on a global scale.
The text says it is designed so the heathen will know that they are men. Throughout history, humanity is constantly trying to build a tower to heaven, constantly inflating its own pride, acting as if we are the autonomous gods of our own destiny.
The Antichrist represents the absolute zenith of human pride and earthly power.
God allows him to rise to the very top so that when his kingdom inevitably crumbles under the weight of divine judgment, the illusion of human supremacy is shattered permanently.
It forces the heathen to look in the mirror and realize they are just frail men. They are not eternal beings.
They are the fading sound waves. They are the chaff on the threshing floor, easily blown away by the wind.
But Augustine notes that this immense global trial will cause weak believers to groan. When they see the wicked prevailing on such a massive scale, they will ask why the final judgment is deferred.
This tension culminates the entire theological framework of the psalm.
The massive, agonizing tension between the hidden workings of God right now and the manifest, undeniable judgment that is rapidly approaching.
It is an unbelievable intellectual feat to extract this much reality from a single piece of scripture.
We have covered a massive scope of thought today. We started with the hidden advent of the Son, a quiet arrival that fundamentally altered the course of human history without anyone noticing at first.
A secret invasion.
We walked through the internal cities of the mind, identifying the corrupt courts and rioting emotions operating inside our own heads. We looked at the terrifying reality of the soul's foot getting trapped in the snare of its own loves.
And we traced it all the way up to the eternal I Am, the solid rock standing in the middle of the rushing river of time.
If we synthesize Augustine's entire framework here, the main takeaway is that reality is not what you observe with your physical eyes. The visible world is a temporary, fading shadow.
The true, weighty drama of the universe is happening invisibly.
It is happening in the hidden judgments of the forge, the secret separations of the human heart, and the eternal decrees of a sovereign God who does not leave a single detail of human history to random chance.
The forge is always burning, and the blacksmith is always working.
We want to leave you with a final lingering thought directly building on what we have covered today. Augustine says that the foot of your soul is your love, and you naturally, inevitably walk toward whatever it is you desire.
It is the law of spiritual gravity.
So, considering the invisible architecture of your own mind, where are your feet taking you right now, and what kind of internal city are you building?